Today we have an interesting social experiment. The social experiment is that given that 10.2 is right around the corner, and I'm saying this not to get you too depressed, because in this case right around the corner means 2 months away from now, so reminding you that we are stuck in this patch for 2 months more felt a little bit mean. So let's just say right around the corner, we are going for what we are wishing for, what we want to see in 10.2 becoming, I don't want to say the best specs in the game, that would be wishing for too much, but at the very least one of the playable specs. Because nowadays, unfortunately, if you want to be even somewhat averagely competitive, it is something you have to wish for. You can't just say, next patch I am going to main Red Paladin. If next patch Red Paladin is weak, you're not going to be invited into keys, you're going to be benched in Mythic Plus, so you have to find yourself a new character. You can't just say, next patch I'm going to tank in Mythic Plus with Prot Warrior. If Prot Warrior stays how it is, you're going to be declined in all plus 22 keys, so you have to find yourself a different spec. With this mindset, we're going to go and think and try to figure out which specs do we want to see be a little bit more meta, or maybe continue to be meta in the next patch. For example, are you okay with continuing to see Guardian Druid as the main tank right now, or do you want to see someone else? Are you already sick of seeing Holy Paladin every time in Mythic Plus and you want to see some other healers, or are you perfectly fine with continuing to have Paladins as your healers in Mythic Plus, for example? So that's the question for today, and that's what we have set up in our tier list, starting from the melee DPS, then going through the range, and then the healers, and then the tanks, based on a scale on how much do we want to see them meta. So starting with the melee DPS, I would like to still see Death Knights in a decent spot. Right now, up to this patch, it's not that either of these have been particularly great. Unholy has kept its decent spot in the raid, but it's never been more than that, and both of the specs in Mythic Plus have been rather poor, so I would like to see them in the next patch gain a bit more power. Where I am more on the okay side is for Demon Hunter. This is quite weird because Demon Hunter has taught us they often end up being here at all times, every time. However, in Dragonflight it's not been nearly as good. Both in Season 1 they weren't by far the strongest one as a DPS spec, including the melee, and then this season they have been even more average. Not bad, but not the best either. So I am okay with this position for Havoc Demon Hunter in 10.2. I would certainly not want to see them, though, meta again. Then we have one of our meme picks. I will in fact move our second meme pick together, so we can move them up all at once, Feral and Survival. So I am more willing to see Feral meta. I think Survival is still hurting from the abomination they created at the end of Shadowlands, so I still don't want to see them as much yet, but I am more willing to see more Feral Druids. I think out of all of the specs of Druid, we have cycled over time, seeing Guardian, Super Meta, Resto Druid or Balanced Druid even. The only one that seems to have missed out on this meta train for now for Druid is Feral. So I'm fine with seeing Feral as one of the meta specs in the next patch. Then we have the talk of Warriors. Warriors are not one of the strongest specs in the raid or one of the strongest specs in Mythic Plus. Neither were they in the previous patch. I am still somewhat okay with their position though. I don't mind them being popular. It's not that they annoy me nearly as much as Havoc Demon Hunters do. I'm also fine with seeing quite a few of them rather than wanting less warriors as a DPS. So they remain, to me at least, on the average side when it comes to DPS. I wouldn't mind them anyways being more popular in the next patch. One of the first specs which I still don't mind continuing being popular, even though they already are, is enhancement. I think enhancement has been quite good in the Season 1 with the addition of Wind Fury as well. Season 1 of Dragonflight into Season 2, they were doing well both in the Raid and in Mythic Plus right now as well. So even though they are already doing fine, they are the first. The first of the currently popular specs we are seeing, which I wouldn't mind, continuing to do well, continuing to be considered as a strong spec, because they just play very well. We want to reward specs that play well, like enhancement does, with being popular. We then have the big question mark of the season, which is rogues, because rogues are being reworked. If we have to go by the standards of the reworks of Blizzard, which end up being very OP, I think it's inevitable that one of these 3 rogue specs will become meta. My wish, purely because of a numbers game of being the least meta of the rogue specs, historically, is to have Assassination be way more popular. And I think overall, both Subtlety and Outlaw have had their time. I think that even with the many complaints of rogue players, at the end of the day, especially Subtlety has been one of the more powerful and overall played specs for melee throughout this expansion, so it's not that they have been suffering too hard in terms of results. Meanwhile, this thing is just purely my bias against Outlaw. I just don't like Outlaw. I don't want to see Outlaw. And also, if we want to see Assassination meta, by result, the other 2 specs of Rogue are going to be seen less often. Ret is difficult because Ret was in the unknown category until this expansion. Then they were reworked, they became quite good. So where do we want to put them? I think they are still fine. Perhaps the very widespread popularity of Ret that they currently have, even if they're not one of the best specs, might push me to put them here. Just to see a few less melee players going Ret for some reason, even if Ret is not doing that well. So that's where I would probably put them still. Then, as the last of the melee DPS, we have the forever question of Windwalker, which is an undecipherable spec on whenever it's gonna be good or weak. I don't mind seeing Windwalker, honestly. I think it would be nice for them to be viable. They have been strong and viable at multiple points throughout these expansions, so it's not that they are some niche hipster spec, but still, I wouldn't mind seeing one of the Monk specs becoming one of the more meta picks in the next patch. Finishing the melee, we have to move over the range DPS, and we start with the Balance Druid. I mentioned being biased against Outlaw. Here is what I'm biased against when it comes to the ranged. Balance. I don't want to see Balance Druids. That's really just my answer to it, especially when I want Feral to be meta. If I want Feral to be meta, there is not going to be a Balance Druid meta either, so let's just remove them from the DPS pool. Devastation. Devastation, as you notice, we don't have the other option, Augmentation. That's because in this tier list we are making the assumption that Augmentation will be rightfully removed from the game in 10.2, so I am wishing, if for that, I am wishing for more Devastation. Because Devastation meta means there is no Augmentation. Devastation meta means they are the strongest pick in their class, meaning hopefully we won't see Augmentation in 10.2, at least in its current version right now in live. Then we have Hunters. Hunters might have suffered enough. As I said, there were many crimes committed by Survival in Shadowlands. Hunters did do a fair share of crimes in Shadowlands when it came to their OPness, but it was nowhere near as bad as Survival. So I think at least one of these 2 could perhaps deserve to become meta again. I think the last time the biggest meta jump was Marksmanship with their whole Night Fae ability in Shadowlands. So this time around we could go for Beast Mastery, and I don't mind seeing fewer Marksmanship Hunters for a while. That would be my take in 10.2. Since I haven't seen that many Hunters players recently, I wouldn't mind seeing more of them. Then we have Mage. Now, as I said, this video was my opinion. Unfortunately, if it was my opinion, I would just put all mages here because I am sick of seeing mages. However, I have to stay even just a little bit in reality and know that there is no situation in which all 3 mages will just be overall garbage. So, my hope is to see fewer fire mages. Once again, who could have guessed it? Fire mages was bad. At the start of the expansion, all it took was one mid-patch rework, and out of nowhere, fire mage, what a surprise, goes once again to become super meta. So, I am dead tired of seeing fire meta everywhere. So, fire needs to die. Frost also needs to be lower down because I want to see arcane being played more. If I really have to choose for a mage to be in my groups, even though I don't want mage players in my groups, then at least make it arcane and not fire. Then we have Shadow. Shadow, I have gotten my fair share of seeing Shadow players this expansion already, so I would like for it to stop. That's just all of the explanation I will give on seeing Shadow Priest players. That's really all there is. Elemental. Talking about niche, underplayed, hipster, underground spec, that's one of the other specs I would like to see more relevant in the meta. Whether it is Mythic Plus or whether it is the raid, I would like to see them being more considered in the next patch, as they have had quite some rough time recently. And by recently I mean a few years by now. So it would be nice if for one patch they would go back at being more relevant overall. We move then into Warlock. So I am done with this entire meta that makes a certain specs viable because it relies around power infusion and its strong cooldowns. So demo, I am done. I don't want to see demo Warlocks again. Destro committed very heavy sins together with survival at the end of Shadowlands. They have been attempting to commit a few more this expansion. Luckily, they are not nearly as strong this expansion, so I would like to keep them where they are. I would like to not make them that much more popular. If I had to choose once more, since they work pretty much like mages, at least one Warlock spec needs to be good every patch, then I would like to go with Affliction. Out of the 3, I would like to see the return of a few more Affliction players, especially in Mythic Plus over the raid. We are done with the DPS. So that's already a pretty good image, imagining some Mythic Plus meta in 10.2 where the picks are gonna be Feral Assassination and even Beast Mastery. That would be a hilarious composition, which I don't think even in patch 17.3 in the year of the Lord 2042 we will see a comp like that, but this is just pure hopium, so that's what I want to see in 10.2. Then we have the healers. For the healers, of course, we can go for the queen or king, not too sure about the pronoun of the spec, of hopium, which is Mistweaver. Mistweaver has not been one of the main pick as far as healing goes since what it feels like forever. So of course every time we want to see some change in the healing power, then Mistweaver is always first in line. What I want to see toned down is of course Paladin, although however this seems to be a far cry from reality. I don't think that's gonna happen, and you can't say I'm too biased since I am playing Holy Paladin myself, so I would be hurting myself with this happening in 10.2. Then we have the more balanced camp of healers. These are all somewhat in the okay range. I think the position of Preservation Evoker in the next patch as a solid healer, while not the super meta pick, would be strong. Same goes for Resto Druid. I would perhaps like to see a few amount of Holy Priests and perhaps a few more Discipline Priests, mostly because I consider Discipline the harder, the more competitive and also the more satisfying spec to pull off compared to this meme of a spec. So that's where I would go if I wanted to see more healers in patch 10.2. These 2 picks right here being the more sought after healers. Lastly, Resto Shaman. Resto Shaman is more on the line of the previous 2 specs. Perhaps of the 3 are the ones that might need a buff. They might need to be closer to being a little bit stronger because right now they are somewhat weak. However, we can still put some hopes in the tier set. Maybe they get a legitimately powerful tier set that can change the entire spec, as we have seen it can happen to quite a few of the specs in terms of increasing their power. So that's where I would also put Resto Shaman. The hardest of the wishes, the hardest of the prediction is definitely the tanks, which is also why I left it last. At this point, if you know me and if you watch my videos, you know that I consider the only thing that matters for the balance of the tanks in the meta Mythic Plus. Some other specs can change their value if they are also powerful in the raid, but tanks in particular, they very often turn out to be the ones who are powerful in Mythic Plus only, who become meta. Very rarely there is going to be a meta tank like Brewmaster that is only powerful in the raid and then never used in Mythic Plus. Almost always the tanks used a lot in Mythic Plus end up being the ones used in the raid as well. So if we had to look at the tanks with lenses on Mythic Plus and the meta in Mythic Plus, well, I am tired, I have to say this, because they have been getting away with this for too long. I am tired of Blood Decays. Yes, they have not specifically been the meta tank, the #1 tank for a while. They have been beaten by Prot Warrior, and then they have been beaten by Prot Paladin, and then they have been beaten by Vengeance or by Guardian. But they were always the second in line or the third in line. They've always been one of the top 2 tanks in the raid as well. The safe pick, the safe choice, the self-sufficient tank that can play solo in a Mythic Plus key. So that's enough. I've seen enough of them for once. I would like to see them just out of the meta completely, not always hanging on that second, third spot they have had for a long time. On an opposite side, I would like to see Brewmaster as the tank of choice in 10.2. Going pretty much by a process of elimination, most of these tanks have had their time this expansion, whether it was Prot Warrior at the start, then passed by Prot Paladin when they were buffed, then passed by Guardian and Vengeance later on in this season. So Brewmaster is basically the last one out that I would like to see being one of the major picks. As for the other tanks, I would like to see fewer Prot Paladins and more Prot Warriors. I'm also okay with the current state of Guardian Druid, provided though they get nerfed. So yeah, I guess considering 60% of all high keys are currently done by Guardian Druids, perhaps, lowering them down a little bit could do the trick. And then I'm also fine with the state of Vengeance. I also wouldn't mind seeing Vengeance for a little bit more. Definitely seeing them more than these 3 specs. So this spot is deserved right now for Vengeance. This would be the overall hopes for 10.2. The ones I want to see in the meta for the next season. I'm making this, of course, to then screenshot this and paste it back in a couple of months to see the results, the actual results in the game compared to this wish list. As I said, the chances that we will see a Mythic Plus comp pushing high keys made up of Double Monk is essentially impossible, so that's already not gonna happen, but maybe something like Mistweaver, Prot Warrior, Arcane, Assassination, and Feral. Maybe by 13.2, maybe in 8 years, we might see this comp. Maybe, but yeah, it's a long shot. A bit more chance of these specs becoming stronger in the raid, perhaps. Anyways, we will see. We will see as we enter the PTR of 10.2 and we start seeing the intentions of Blizzard when it comes to balance tuning, possible reworks and spec updates to some of these specs in here, how things are going to improve in 10.2 or maybe get even worse. Maybe we will somehow do even worse than what we have done with Exodia in this patch, although that would be a pretty tough feat to beat, honestly. I mean, congrats to Blizzard if they actually end up being able to create something even more broken than what we have gotten in 10.1.5. So, keeping this as a time capsule for the next season to see how effectively things will turn out to compare to this, we can now leave each other. You can, of course, guys, let me know down in the comments what are your hopes as far as the extremes. What are your hopes of seeing meta specs in 10.2, as well as what are your hopes of specs you really want to stop seeing or you really don't want to see anymore in 10.2 being that meta or being that present in the meta. with the goodbyes for today. We are, of course, saying goodbyes to all of our Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, which, as usual, can still be given for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. So, with these things out of the way, we can say goodbye to each other. Thank you guys again for watching, see you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, well, I went a little bit overboard. I think this video was supposed to be some 5 minutes shorter, but as usual, I don't know how to cut things down when I speak. God damn it.